You can run every diagnostic in the world, the old crew chief used to say, but a machine will always tell the truth to the person who actually listens. The AH-64 Apache sat motionless on the sun-baked tarmac of Fort Holloway, its long rotor blades drooping under the heavy afternoon heat like tired wings refusing to rise. Around it, a ring of engineers and technicians stood in quiet frustration, their crisp coveralls already darkened with sweat after nearly 8 hours of work. Laptops rested on rolling tool carts, screens glowing with lines of diagnostic data that stubbornly insisted everything was perfectly normal. Fuel pressure normal. Ignition sequence normal. Electrical systems normal. Every sensor on the aircraft reported green across the board. Yet the helicopter refused to wake. The silence around the machine had become almost personal, as if the Apache itself were quietly defying every expert standing around it. Kyle Kramer, the lead technician, kicked the landing skid with the side of his boot, the dull metal thud echoing across the hangar apron. At 27, Kramer was one of the Army's rising stars in aviation maintenance, a graduate of one of the most advanced avionics programs in the country, and the kind of man who trusted computers more than instinct. He folded his arms and stared at the silent helicopter with a mixture of pride and irritation. 8 hours, he muttered to no one in particular. 8 hours and a $12 million aircraft won't even spin the starter. A few of the younger technicians exchanged uneasy looks, but said nothing. Beyond the aircraft, the flat Texas horizon shimmered in waves of heat, the air thick with the smell of jet fuel and hot metal. Somewhere across the base a transport plane roared overhead, its engines echoing through the sky, a reminder that every other aircraft at Fort Holloway was flying today, except this one. A few yards away from the circle of frustrated experts stood a man no one had noticed at first. He leaned casually against the metal railing near the hangar door, hands tucked into the pockets of a faded olive jacket that had clearly seen decades of sun and weather. His white hair lifted slightly in the dry breeze, and his pale blue eyes remained fixed not on the technicians, but on the Apache itself. While the others stared at computer screens and digital gauges, the old man studied the machine the way a rancher studies a restless horse, quietly, patiently, waiting for it to reveal what it was thinking. Lieutenant Daniel Wells finally noticed him and walked over with the stiff posture of a young officer, still learning how authority should look. "Sir," Wells said politely but firmly, "this is a restricted maintenance area." The old man didn't seem offended. He didn't even move. His eyes stayed on the helicopter, as if he were listening for something no one else could hear. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the rough calm of someone who had spent most of his life around roaring engines and open skies. "General Michelson asked me to take a look." The lieutenant blinked, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Before he could respond, Kramer overheard and turned around with an amused grin spreading across his face. "Hold on," Kramer said, walking closer and wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "You're the guy the commander called in?" His eyes scanned the old man from head to toe, the worn boots, the weathered jacket, the quiet confidence that didn't seem to match the situation. Kramer chuckled and glanced back at his crew. "Well, that's perfect," he said with a sarcastic shrug. "We've got a dozen certified engineers, 3 avionics specialists, and a manufacturer on standby, and the solution is apparently a retired mechanic." The technicians laughed softly, the tension breaking just enough to release their frustration. The old man didn't react to the laughter. He simply pushed away from the railing and began walking slowly toward the helicopter, his gaze tracing the curved armor panels and sensor pods along the fuselage. The Apache still sat perfectly silent beneath the blazing afternoon sun, and for the first time all day, someone was looking at it as if it were more than just a machine. The old man stopped beside the Apache and looked up at the long sweep of the rotor blades, his pale blue eyes moving slowly across the aircraft, as if he were reading a story written in metal. The technicians watched him with open curiosity now, some leaning against tool carts, others folding their arms as if waiting for a show to begin. Kyle Kramer shook his head and gave a short laugh that carried across the tarmac. "Well, go ahead," he said, gesturing toward the helicopter with a theatrical wave of his hand. "You have the floor." The old man did not answer. He simply began walking around the aircraft at a slow, steady pace, his boots crunching softly on the gravel and sun-baked concrete. Lieutenant Daniel Wells glanced down at the tablet in his hands and frowned slightly. The diagnostics report everything is within operational parameters, he said, almost defensively, as if speaking to reassure himself as much as anyone else. Fuel system pressure is normal. Ignition circuits are intact. Electrical grid is stable. There is no mechanical fault detected. Kramer nodded toward the glowing screens on the carts. Exactly. Every sensor on this aircraft says it should be flying right now. He pointed at the silent helicopter with a sarcastic smile. But here we are. The old man paused near the tail boom, studying the long shaft that connected the engine housing to the rear rotor assembly. His fingers brushed lightly across the metal surface, not touching anything important, simply feeling the aircraft the way a musician might run a hand along the body of an instrument. One of the younger technicians leaned toward another and whispered, loud enough for several others to hear. Maybe he is checking if it is still a helicopter. A few quiet chuckles followed. Kramer watched the old man complete a full circle around the aircraft before stopping near the engine cowling. Look, Kramer said with a friendly but unmistakably patronizing tone, I appreciate the enthusiasm. But this is an Apache, not a farm truck from 1965. This machine has thousands of sensors, flight computers, thermal monitors, and a digital diagnostic system that runs through every subsystem on board. If something was wrong, the computer would tell us. The old man kept his eyes on the aircraft. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and almost thoughtful. Computers are very good at reading numbers. Kramer smirked. That is what they are designed for. The old man nodded slowly, still studying the aircraft's engine housing. Machines, he continued quietly, are very good at hiding their problems. Lieutenant Wells shifted his weight, uncertain whether the comment was meant as advice or criticism. Kramer folded his arms again and looked at the silent helicopter as if daring it to prove him right. So what do you think is wrong with it? He asked, clearly expecting either silence or something absurd. The old man finally looked away from the aircraft and met Kramer's eyes. There was no challenge in his expression, only a quiet certainty that seemed strangely out of place among the rows of computers and tools. The engine is not the problem, he said. The technicians around them went silent for a moment before a few confused murmurs spread through the group. Kramer blinked once and then laughed openly. That is a bold diagnosis, he said, pointing toward the Apache's massive turbine housing. Considering the engine is the only thing that is supposed to start the helicopter. The old man turned his gaze back toward the aircraft, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if something about the machine had just confirmed a suspicion. No, he said softly. The engine is ready. Kramer tilted his head, amused and skeptical at the same time. Then why has it been sitting here for 8 hours doing absolutely nothing? The old man took a slow step toward the side of the helicopter and looked along the smooth line of the fuselage, where several small maintenance panels sat perfectly flush with the armor plating. The afternoon wind lifted slightly, carrying the distant hum of aircraft engines from across the base. After a long, quiet moment, he raised one hand and pointed toward a small access panel just beneath the exhaust assembly. Because something much smaller, he said calmly, is stopping it from waking up. For a moment nobody said anything. The technicians followed the direction of the old man's finger toward the small rectangular access panel beneath the exhaust assembly. It was barely larger than a sheet of paper and perfectly aligned with the surrounding armor plating. To anyone else it looked exactly like every other panel on the aircraft. Kyle Kramer walked closer and ran his hand across the metal surface, pressing lightly against the bolts that held it in place. It is flush, he said confidently. Torque specifications are perfect. The sensors behind that panel are reporting normal readings. The old man remained still beside the helicopter, studying the panel as though he could see through the metal itself. Lieutenant Daniel Wells glanced at the diagnostics on his tablet again and nodded in agreement with Kramer. Subsystem monitoring shows no fault in that section, he added. Opening it would require breaking a sealed inspection tag and generating a full maintenance report. Kramer looked back at the old man with a grin that carried more amusement than hostility. Which means there is absolutely no reason to open it. The crew nearby shifted their weight, watching the exchange with growing curiosity. A few technicians leaned forward slightly, as if hoping the old man would say something outrageous enough to justify the quiet skepticism hanging in the air. Instead, he simply stepped closer to the aircraft and tilted his head slightly, listening in a way that made several of the younger technicians exchange puzzled glances. The Apache remained completely silent beneath the bright Texas sun. After a long moment, the old man spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "Did anyone actually open the panel?" Kramer sighed softly and shook his head. "No, because the diagnostics already checked everything behind it." He tapped the side of the aircraft lightly with his knuckles. "Modern aviation maintenance does not work on guesses anymore. The system tells us where the problem is." The old man nodded thoughtfully, as if he had heard this explanation many times before. "And what if the system does not know where to look?" Kramer chuckled and looked around at the other technicians. These aircraft run through thousands of automated checks every minute. If something was wrong behind that panel, the computer would have flagged it hours ago. The old man's eyes remained fixed on the small metal plate. His expression was not confrontational. It was patient, almost reflective, like a man remembering something from a very long time ago. The afternoon breeze moved softly across the flight line, carrying the distant echo of another helicopter lifting off somewhere across the base. The sound seemed to settle into the old man's memory. For just a second, the silent Apache on the tarmac was replaced in his mind by another helicopter from decades earlier, a smaller aircraft shaking in humid jungle air while rotor blades thundered overhead and young pilots trusted the crew chief in the back to keep them flying. The image faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the quiet aircraft in front of him. Kramer crossed his arms again and tilted his head slightly. "Look, I respect the experience," he said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "But every engineer here has already inspected this helicopter. Every system has been tested. If there was something wrong behind that panel, we would know." The old man finally turned away from the aircraft and looked at Kramer. There was no irritation in his eyes, only the calm certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime around machines that did not always behave the way manuals expected. "You trust the numbers," he said gently. Kramer nodded. "That is how modern aviation works." The old man turned back toward the Apache and slowly reached toward the small panel again, his finger hovering just above the metal surface without touching it. "I trust what the machine is trying to say," he replied quietly. Several technicians watched him with renewed attention now, the earlier laughter fading into a thoughtful silence. Kramer looked at the panel again, then back at the old man. For the first time that afternoon, the confident technician hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "All right," he said finally, exhaling through his nose. "Let us say you are right." He gestured toward the sealed plate. "What exactly do you think we missed?" The technicians waited for the old man to answer. The hot air above the runway shimmered in slow waves, and the silent Apache stood in the center of the circle like a stubborn animal refusing to move. Kyle Kramer rested one hand on the aircraft side and looked at the small panel again, clearly expecting something vague or nostalgic in response. The old man did not rush. He studied the metal plate for another moment, then spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent more years around helicopters than most people in the hangar had been alive. "You did not miss a broken part," he said calmly. "You missed something that does not show up on a computer." Kramer raised one eyebrow. "And what would that be?" The old man lifted his hand and gently tapped the metal beside the panel with a single finger. The sound was soft but precise, like someone checking the frame of a door. "Alignment," he said. Several technicians glanced at one another. Kramer shook his head slightly. "This aircraft was assembled with laser calibration tools," he replied. "Every panel is measured down to thousandths of an inch." The old man nodded slowly. "That is exactly why nobody checked it by hand." The comment hung in the warm air for a moment. Lieutenant Daniel Wells looked down at his tablet again and scrolled through the maintenance log. "The aircraft completed a full inspection cycle last month," he said carefully. "There were no structural issues reported." The old man remained focused on the panel. Sometimes a machine remembers something the paperwork does not. One of the younger technicians shifted closer, curiosity replacing the earlier amusement. Kramer sighed and leaned against the helicopter again. "You are telling me the entire diagnostic system missed a misaligned panel?" The old man turned his head slightly. "I am saying the system does not know that it matters." The crew grew quiet. Kramer rubbed the back of his neck, clearly debating whether to entertain the idea or dismiss it entirely. "Even if the panel was slightly off," he said, It would not stop the engine from starting. The old man gave a faint smile that carried no mockery, only patience. Not the engine, he said. The airflow. Kramer frowned. The old man pointed toward the exhaust assembly above the panel. That intake pathway feeds temperature sensors inside the turbine housing, he explained. If the airflow pattern changes by even a small amount, the sensors can misread the startup temperature. Wells looked up sharply from the tablet. Kramer's expression shifted from amusement to cautious attention. The old man continued in the same steady tone. The computer sees a temperature imbalance that is not really there, so it refuses to start the sequence. Kramer straightened and looked again at the small metal plate. That would require the panel to be out of alignment by a very specific margin. The old man nodded. Less than a millimeter. The technicians around them exchanged looks again, but this time the laughter did not return. Kramer stepped closer to the aircraft and crouched slightly, running his fingers carefully along the seam of the panel. The metal surface still looked perfectly smooth to the eye. Wells leaned down beside him, studying the edge of the plate. It looks fine, he said quietly. The old man did not move. It does, he agreed. Kramer stood again and crossed his arms, his confidence now mixed with a trace of uncertainty. If that panel is off by less than a millimeter, he said slowly, no one would notice it. The old man looked back at the helicopter with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving on the flight line. Someone would, he replied softly. The breeze shifted again across the runway, and the silent aircraft seemed to wait. Kramer looked at the sealed inspection tag on the panel, then back at the old man. For the first time since the morning began, the lead technician no longer sounded amused when he spoke. All right, he said. Let us say you are right. He gestured toward the panel once more. What makes you so sure? The old man's eyes rested on the aircraft as though it were an old friend speaking in a language only he remembered. Because, he said quietly, I have seen this before. The old man did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the Apache as if the aircraft itself had asked the question. The technicians waited, the earlier laughter now replaced with a growing curiosity that none of them seemed eager to admit. Kyle Kramer folded his arms and studied the quiet figure beside the helicopter. You have seen this before, Kramer repeated slowly. On an Apache? The old man gave a faint shake of his head. Not this one. His gaze drifted upward along the engine housing and the long rotor mast above it, following the lines of the aircraft as though he were remembering something that lived inside the metal itself. The afternoon sun glinted off the curved panels, and for a brief moment the present seemed to blur with another memory from decades earlier. In his mind, the clean runway of Fort Holloway faded into a humid airstrip surrounded by thick green jungle, where helicopters sat in uneven rows beneath a sky heavy with heat. The sound of distant rotor blades filled the air in that memory, a deep, rhythmic pulse that every crew chief could feel in his chest long before the aircraft touched the ground. The old man blinked once and returned to the quiet flight line in front of him. Different helicopter, he said calmly. Different war. Same problem. Several technicians exchanged glances. Kramer shifted his weight and looked again at the small panel beneath the exhaust. So you fixed it the same way? He asked, still half skeptical. The old man did not smile, but something in his expression softened with the patience of someone recalling a very long day from a very long time ago. Not exactly, he said. Back then we did not have computers telling us what should be wrong. Lieutenant Daniel Wells lowered his tablet slightly. Then how did you know where to look? The old man took one slow step toward the Apache and rested his hand lightly against the side of the fuselage. The metal was warm from the sun. Because the helicopter was trying to tell us, he replied. Kramer let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. Machines do not talk. The old man glanced at him. They do, he said, just not in words. The technicians remained silent as he crouched slightly beside the aircraft and examined the seam of the panel again. His fingers moved slowly along the edge, not pressing or adjusting anything, simply feeling the alignment the way a carpenter might run a hand across the grain of wood. Wells watched with growing interest while Kramer looked back and forth between the old man and the perfectly smooth metal surface. Even if you are right, Kramer said carefully, that panel is sealed. Opening it without authorization means a full inspection report and a maintenance delay that will take half the day. The old man stood again and looked at the helicopter's long rotor blades stretching across the bright sky. "If I am wrong," he said calmly, "you lose half a day." Kramer tilted his head. "And if you are right?" The old man's pale blue eyes returned to the silent aircraft as if he already knew the answer. "Then you will learn that sometimes a machine remembers things your system forgot to check." A quiet breeze crossed the runway again, and the helicopter remained perfectly still in the sunlight. Kramer stared at the panel one more time before finally exhaling through his nose. The earlier confidence in his voice had faded, replaced by the cautious tone of a technician who understood that even the best systems could miss something small. He looked toward Lieutenant Wells. "Breaking that inspection seal is technically your call," Kramer said. Wells hesitated, glancing once more at the diagnostics on his tablet before slowly lowering it to his side. The numbers on the screen still insisted that the aircraft was perfectly healthy. Wells looked back at the silent Apache and then at the old man standing beside it with the calm patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting for machines to speak. After a long moment, the lieutenant nodded once. "Open the panel." "Lieutenant Daniel." Wells held the tablet at his side for a moment longer, as if the glowing screen might suddenly contradict the decision he had just made. The diagnostics still showed perfect numbers, perfect systems, perfect conditions. Yet the helicopter remained silent under the afternoon sun. Kyle Kramer looked back at the inspection seal on the panel and exhaled slowly through his nose. "All right," he said quietly. He reached for a screwdriver from the nearby tool cart, the metal clinking softly against the other instruments. The small red inspection tag stretched across one of the bolts, printed with a date from the previous maintenance cycle. Kramer hesitated for a brief second, then snapped the seal with a quick twist of the tool. The sound was small but decisive. Several technicians leaned closer as he removed the first bolt and placed it carefully on the cart beside him. The old man remained still, watching without interference, his pale blue eyes focused on the panel with the patience of someone who had waited through far longer moments than this. One by one, Kramer removed the remaining bolts until the small metal plate loosened. He lifted the panel away and set it down on the cart. The interior compartment behind it was clean and orderly, a narrow assembly of ducts, wiring harnesses, and temperature sensors arranged with the precision expected from modern military engineering. Wells stepped forward and glanced inside while Kramer crouched lower, examining the components with a practiced eye. "Everything looks normal," Kramer said after a moment. The old man did not move. "Look again," he replied quietly. Kramer leaned closer and studied the narrow intake duct that curved inward toward the turbine housing. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The sensors were seated correctly. The wiring was secure. The internal housing showed no visible damage. Then Kramer paused. He ran a fingertip slowly along the edge where the intake duct met the outer casing. "Hold on," he murmured. Wells leaned closer. "What is it?" Kramer did not answer immediately. His brow tightened as he looked more carefully at the alignment where the intake channel connected with the surrounding frame. The difference was almost invisible to the eye. The duct had shifted just slightly within its housing, no more than a fraction of a millimeter. Just enough to narrow the airflow channel by a tiny amount. Kramer sat back slowly on his heels. "That is not supposed to be like that," he said quietly. Wells leaned in further, now seeing it as well. The channel was not perfectly centered. The change was so small that a visual inspection from the outside would never have caught it. Kramer looked over his shoulder toward the old man. The earlier sarcasm was gone from his voice when he spoke again. "You said less than a millimeter." The old man gave a small nod. Kramer returned his attention to the intake assembly and carefully loosened two small mounting screws that held the duct in place. With a gentle adjustment, he shifted the component back into perfect alignment. The movement was almost imperceptible, but the duct now sat exactly where the design specifications intended it to be. Kramer tightened the screws again and slowly stood. For a moment, no one spoke. The technicians around them watched with focused attention now, the earlier amusement replaced by quiet concentration. Kramer wiped his hands on the rag and looked toward the old man once more. "If this works," he said slowly, "it means the airflow sensor was reading the wrong temperature threshold during startup." The old man gave the faintest hint of a smile. "The machine was telling you it could not breathe correctly." Wells glanced at Kramer. "We should close the panel and run the startup sequence." Kramer nodded. He reattached the metal plate carefully, tightening each bolt with precise, turns before stepping back from the aircraft. The Apache still stood silent in the heat of the afternoon, its long rotor blades motionless against the bright sky. Kramer looked toward the cockpit and raised his voice slightly. "All right," he called to one of the technicians near the control panel. "Let us see if she wants to wake up now." The technician stepped back from the helicopter as the final bolt on the panel was tightened. The metal plate sat perfectly flush against the fuselage once again, hiding the tiny adjustment that had taken only seconds to make, but had taken an entire morning to discover. The heat of the Texas afternoon hung heavy over the runway, and for a brief moment the entire flight line seemed to hold its breath. Kyle Kramer wiped his hands on the rag and looked toward the cockpit where one of the technicians had climbed into the pilot's seat. The young specialist adjusted the headset and glanced down at the instrument panel inside the Apache. "All right," he called out through the open canopy. "Beginning startup sequence." A low click sounded from inside the aircraft as the electrical systems came online. The technicians around the helicopter leaned slightly closer, their earlier skepticism now replaced by quiet anticipation. Inside the cockpit, the technician moved his hand across the startup controls with careful precision. A faint hum spread through the aircraft as the onboard systems awakened. Lieutenant Daniel Wells folded his arms and watched the rotor mast above them. The first attempt earlier that morning had ended in complete silence. Now every pair of eyes on the tarmac was fixed on the helicopter. The hum deepened into a slow mechanical whine as the turbine began its ignition cycle. Kyle Kramer glanced briefly at the old man, standing a few feet away. The man had not moved. His gaze remained calmly on the helicopter, as if the result had already been decided long before the panel had been opened. The turbine whine rose steadily, growing stronger and smoother with each passing second. A few technicians exchanged surprised looks as the system continued past the stage where it had failed earlier that day. Inside the cockpit, the technician leaned forward slightly, watching the gauges. "Temperature readings are stabilizing," he announced. The sound of the turbine grew deeper, filling the air around the aircraft with a steady rising tone. Kramer slowly straightened his posture as realization began to settle across the group. The startup sequence continued without interruption. Then, with a powerful rush of sound, the rotor system engaged. The massive blades above them began to turn. At first the movement was slow and deliberate, each blade slicing through the hot air with a heavy rhythmic motion. Dust stirred along the edges of the runway as the rotation gathered speed. Within seconds the Apache had fully awakened, its rotor blades spinning smoothly against the bright blue sky. A wave of astonished silence swept through the technicians standing around the aircraft. No one spoke. They simply watched as the helicopter settled into a steady idle, the powerful machine that had refused to move for 8 long hours now humming with controlled strength. Kyle Kramer let out a slow breath that he had not realized he was holding. He stared at the spinning rotor blades, and then turned slowly toward the old man. The earlier confidence in his voice had completely vanished. "You were right," he said quietly. The old man gave a small nod, but did not look particularly surprised. Lieutenant Wells glanced up at the aircraft, then back toward the old man as well. The realization was spreading quickly now among the crew. Every engineer on the flight line had trusted the diagnostics. Every expert had trusted the computer systems. Yet the solution had come from a man who had simply listened to the machine. One of the younger technicians near the tool cart spoke in a hushed voice that carried through the sound of the engine. How did he know? Kramer looked at the old man again, the question clearly lingering in his own mind as well. But before anyone could ask it aloud, a distant vehicle approached along the edge of the runway, its tires crunching across the gravel access road leading toward the hangar. The dark staff vehicle rolled to a stop near the flight line, and the driver stepped out quickly to open the rear door. A tall figure in a neatly pressed uniform stepped out and looked immediately toward the now spinning helicopter. Several technicians straightened instinctively as they recognized him. General Robert Michelson had just arrived. The powerful thrum of the Apache's engine rolled across the flight line as the rotor blades gained steady speed, sending warm gusts of wind sweeping across the concrete. Dust lifted in small spirals near the landing gear while technicians instinctively stepped back from the aircraft. Kyle Kramer kept his eyes on the spinning blades for a moment longer before turning toward the approaching vehicle. The dark staff car had already stopped near the edge of the tarmac, and the tall officer who stepped out carried the unmistakable posture of command. General Robert Michelson adjusted his cap slightly as he looked toward the helicopter, the steady rotation of the blades reflecting in his eyes. The driver closed the rear door quietly while the general walked forward with calm, deliberate steps. The technicians around the aircraft straightened almost instantly, their earlier astonishment replaced by disciplined posture. Lieutenant Daniel Wells took 2 steps forward and raised a respectful salute. "General Michelson, sir." The general returned the salute briefly but did not slow his stride as he approached the aircraft. His attention remained fixed on the Apache now idling smoothly, its turbine humming with controlled strength. For several seconds, he simply watched the machine, as if confirming something he had already expected to see. Then his gaze moved past the technicians and settled on the old man standing quietly near the side of the helicopter. The change in the general's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The firm, composed look of command softened into something closer to recognition. Kyle Kramer noticed the shift and followed the general's line of sight toward the old man. General Michelson walked the remaining distance across the tarmac and stopped a few feet away from him. For a moment the sound of the engine was the only thing anyone heard. Then the general spoke in a calm voice that carried easily through the steady hum of the aircraft. "Eli Vance," he said. The old man gave a small nod, as if greeting someone he had known for many years. "General." Kramer's eyes widened slightly. Around him several technicians exchanged confused glances. The name meant nothing to most of them. Yet the tone in the general's voice carried a level of respect they rarely heard on a flight line. The general looked briefly at the spinning rotor above them before returning his attention to the old man. "I see the Apache is awake again." The old man glanced up at the aircraft and then back toward the general. "She just needed to breathe properly." The general gave a quiet smile. "That sounds like you." Kramer finally stepped closer, still trying to understand what he was witnessing. "Sir," he said carefully, addressing the general. The adjustment he suggested corrected the airflow sensor readings. "The system is running perfectly now." General Michelson nodded once as if the result had never been in doubt. He turned back toward the old man. "These young engineers are some of the best in the country," he said calmly. "But there are some lessons computers do not teach." Several technicians listened in silence, the earlier pride in their technology now replaced by thoughtful humility. The general took 1 step closer to Eli Vance and extended his hand. The old man accepted the handshake without ceremony, but the gesture carried a quiet weight that did not go unnoticed by anyone on the flight line. Kramer glanced at Lieutenant Wells again, still puzzled. Wells leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly so only the nearby crew could hear. "Before digital diagnostics," he said softly, "every helicopter unit had someone who could hear problems others could not." Kramer looked back toward the old man as the rotor blades continued to spin above them. The Apache stood alive and steady on the tarmac, its powerful engine humming with the calm confidence of a machine finally understood. For the first time that day, Kyle Kramer realized that the quiet man standing beside the aircraft was not simply an old mechanic brought in to help. He was something far rarer. Someone who had been listening to helicopters long before computers ever learned how. The rotor blades continued their steady rotation above the Apache, slicing the warm Texas air into powerful waves that rippled across the tarmac. The deep hum of the turbine settled into a smooth, confident rhythm, the kind of sound every helicopter crew trusted with their lives. Around the aircraft, the technicians stood in thoughtful silence, watching the machine that had refused to move all morning now running exactly as it was designed to. Kyle Kramer rested his hands on his hips and looked up at the spinning blades once more before turning toward Eli Vance. The earlier skepticism in his expression had completely disappeared, replaced by something closer to quiet respect. 8 hours, Kramer said slowly, almost to himself. 8 hours of diagnostics and software checks. He glanced back at the aircraft and shook his head with a faint, humbled smile. And the answer was smaller than a credit card. Eli Vance followed his gaze toward the helicopter, the steady wind from the rotors moving gently through his white hair. "Machines do not always fail in big ways," he said calmly. "Sometimes they whisper." Lieutenant Daniel Wells stood nearby, watching the old man with new understanding. "Most of us were listening to the computer," he admitted. Eli nodded slightly. "The computer listens to numbers." The machine listens to the air. The technicians around them exchanged thoughtful looks. Many of them had spent years studying complex engineering systems, learning to trust the endless stream of digital information that modern aircraft produced. Yet none of those screens had noticed the subtle shift in airflow that an experienced eye and patient hand had discovered in minutes. General Robert Michelson remained standing beside the aircraft, his posture relaxed as he watched the crew absorb the lesson that had just unfolded in front of them. After a moment he spoke again, his voice steady and reflective. "Technology changes every decade," he said, "but experience stays with a person for life." His eyes moved briefly toward the helicopter and then back to Eli. This man spent 30 years keeping aircraft in the sky when the only diagnostic tool was instinct and responsibility. The general looked back toward the technicians. And every pilot who ever flew with him trusted that instinct. Kyle Kramer looked at Eli again, this time with genuine curiosity. "How many helicopters did you work on?" he asked. Eli thought for a moment before answering. Enough to know when one is trying to say something. A quiet smile passed across several faces in the group. The Apache continued idling beside them, its powerful engine steady and dependable now that the tiny misalignment had been corrected. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the spinning rotor blades, creating bright flashes of light that swept rhythmically across the runway. After a moment, Eli glanced once more at the aircraft and then turned toward the edge of the tarmac. His work was finished, and he carried himself with the calm simplicity of someone who had never needed recognition to do the job well. As he began to walk away, Kyle Kramer spoke again, his voice respectful now. "Mr. Vance." Eli paused and turned slightly. Kramer gave a small nod of appreciation. "Thank you for showing us how to listen." Eli returned the nod with quiet humility. Then he continued walking across the warm concrete toward the hangar doors while the Apache hummed steadily behind him. For the young technicians standing on that runway, the lesson would stay with them long after the sound of the engine faded. Because sometimes the most powerful machines in the world do not need more technology. Sometimes they simply need someone patient enough to hear what they have been trying to say all along.